Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set, cocked, locked. Here we go. Your dial set correctly to USA Prepares. Thank you for being with us today. Jason is engineering the broadcast in Minnesota at Genesis Communications Network. I'm Vincent Finelli. Captain John Ragan's with us. Welcome, Captain John Ragan.
Is it Monday already?
Hey! and you know the funny thing about that? For those who are new to the class, I would call Captain John and I'd say, hey, over the weekend. Or hey, meaning I've got to do hay today, or I've got to do hay tomorrow or the next day. And Captain John would jump right in and sit in my seat or be with me side by side. So, no, it's not Monday, and we broadcasted a lot of Mondays, Captain John Ragan, but thank you for being with us today, taking time out of your schedule to share lots of information. I really appreciate it. You know, I was thinking over the last couple of days, I received from Sam's Club an email saying, you can save a lot of money. You can buy one of these Asian television sets or Asian appliances. Refrigerators, freezers, washers, dryers, things like that, with names like LG and names like Samsung. Nice looking appliances. And I was thinking about that. Where's like Whirlpool, General Electric, Philco, Frigidaire? Where are names like that? They weren't on there. And so to add to that, neighbor stopped over and he had his Toyota truck and he said he had a couple of questions about his transmission indicator. And I said, well, I've never driven one. I wasn't allowed to have a Japanese car because my dad was in World War II. And I remember my dad saying, are you kidding me? Those guys are trying to kill me. And of course, I was thinking about your dad, who was in the Philippines as well as my dad, although they probably never met each other. They probably were brothers in arms in the same area of the world. And so we've forgotten, John, that our fathers were attacked by the Japanese who wanted to kill them. Would you say I'm exaggerating or embellishing, or would you say that's the absolute truth?
It's interesting. Just this morning in the American Minute, which is published by Bill Federer, talked about the Japanese, and I'd apparently forgotten out of history the Japanese Empire early in the 20th century, where they had controlled parts of China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, that whole area. They were like the ninth largest maritime power and I think the third largest economic power at the time. And later on in the article, it referenced a book that talked about this incident where a squadron of 20 planes were shot down, and only one of the pilots was retrieved. And for better or worse, that pilot was George Bush. And in that discussion, the other 19 pilots were basically decapitated and eaten. So there's a lot of history that we either never learned or we've forgotten. And this has implications for what's coming as well. So just wanted to throw that in. Have a nice day.
Yeah. And I sat down at the kitchen table with our neighbor, and I said, what do you think of that Toyota truck? It's the big one, the Tundra. He says, I really like it. It really rides great, except the mileage is really, really bad. And I said, well, 5.7 liter. I've got a 4.3 liter Chevrolet pickup truck. It gets 18 plus miles per gallon all the time, maybe more, depending on if I'm not working it, if I'm not in the city. They make American trucks. And he paid 4 times more for his pickup truck than I paid for mine. I only paid $3,000 even for it. And but anyway, we've forgotten that our fathers, we could say forefathers, we could say grandfathers, we could say fathers, fought against, and this may be a shock to some people, we literally fought the Japanese. They attacked us. Literally. There was a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. They bombed a U.S. naval base in 1941 in Pearl Harbor. A lot of us got killed. And then the Germans declared war on us. You may not think that the Nazis declared war on us, but they did. So we were fighting the Japanese and the Germans. And I had some uncles who fought the Germans. And you think they would drive a Mercedes? Absolutely not. And you think we would have a Japanese car in our house? Absolutely not. And that's just the way it was. Because and they were called Japs. I'll just use that word. I don't care whether people think it's offensive or not, but that's what they were called. The Japanese, when we were fighting them, the U.S. servicemen called them Japs, J-A-P-S. And it's just an abbreviation. It's the first 3 letters of the word Japan. And that's what they called them, Japs. It's not a slur. I want to make sure everybody understands I'm not using a slur against the Japanese. It's just the name that they were called. So I was just thinking about that, Captain John Ragan. Our fathers had it pretty rough. They got to smell death. They got to see death. They were right up close to it. And the Japanese wanted to kill us. So next time y'all think about buying that piece of electronic gear that comes from Asia, sometimes Japan, mostly from China now, think about that. How do you feel about that? How would your grandfathers and fathers feel who fought in that horrible war? And why was I thinking about that? Well, because I was watching Ken Burns' video series, The Civil War, also called The War of Northern Aggression. I'll tell you what, they call him one of the greatest presidents that ever lived. He sure got a lot of people killed. And I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln. Boy, did he get a lot of people killed. And the North invaded the South. So if you were to ask a rebel, why are you fighting? The answer was, because you guys attacked us. You guys are here. And then Sherman, out of control, he burned everything in sight. Villages, farms, buildings. Where I lived in Virginia, in rural Virginia, there's a monument to what the North did. They came and they set fires, really hot fires, on top of the railroad tracks. And then they would bend the railroad tracks. The idea was, well, if we bend it, y'all can't use it. And that's what happened. And they killed animals. They killed people. They burned villages. They destroyed the infrastructure. It was like, it's awful. And if you're wondering why the South, people who remember and have relatives that lived in that particular area of the South, you wonder why they don't like the Northerners? That's because the Northerners came and destroyed the South. Any comments, John, before we get into today's topics?
Oh, boy, we could take so many side trips on that. We were essentially taught to deify Lincoln when we were in school. One of the greatest Americans ever. And there's actually some evidence that he was really our first communist president. And he did a number on killing the Constitution. That's when our 10th Amendment was trashed, because the states then no longer had rights because if you wanted to go against the federal government, they now have the precedent of sending in armed forces to deal with that. And it also rubs me the wrong way how the Emancipation Proclamation is held in such high regard when it didn't do a thing, because the Confederate States was another nation. Can you imagine today if the president, issued a proclamation to free the political prisoners in China? I mean, it was basically the same thing. There was no effect. And even if, he considered the Confederate States still part of the United States, the president doesn't have the power to do that. It took a constitutional amendment, which, did happen shortly thereafter. But, even on top of that, you look at some of the history before that, I think it's rarely, if ever, taught that the United States stopped importing slaves very early in the 19th century. And slavery was on the way out because of industrialization. The very labor-intensive crops, the sugar, the tobacco, the cotton, a lot of that labor is now replaced with machinery. And here we are having to deal today with the aftermath of all of that. And then to top it off, we have the people of color deifying white guys nowadays. Well, it's not white people. It was white Southern Democrats. But still, they won't not get off the plantation. They're still loyal to master. Vincent?
Well, from my understanding, a lot of Northerners, Yankees, were involved in the slave trade, bringing them over here for sale and purchase by the Southern plantations. So it's not like the Southerners did this all by themselves. There's a great deal of enrichment by the Yankees, if you want to call them that, in the slave trade.
And let's not forget the people that captured the blacks to be sold into slavery were Muslims and some of the African, tribal leaders. Mm-hmm. And you never hear that today either.
Mm-hmm. And President Abraham Lincoln, in January of 1863, released the Emancipation Proclamation. And he decided that he was going to free the slaves. But what he did, that was not the reason for the War of Northern Aggression. It was about states' rights. But in the middle of this war, brother against brother, that's when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. So if you think it's about slavery, no, it wasn't. That was in the middle of the war because the North wasn't doing all that well. Bobby Lee was giving the North a real run, and casualties on both sides were horrific. But in order to win, that's why we had the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll be right back. Captain John Ragan's with us. Rich Sheehan is going to be busy for several weeks getting ready for winter. He's fine. I don't want you to think anything has happened to him. He's just busy on the farm getting ready for winter. He cans and he raises his own food, hunts, fishes, and so he's getting ready for winter. He'll be with us in a few weeks. And George in New Hampshire, welcome. You're on with Captain John Ragan.
Hi, Vincent. Hello, John. If I could just weigh in quick. There's enough evidence now that if you read some of the writings of Otto Bismarck, who was called the Iron Chancellor, who ultimately, I think, was responsible for the unification or played a very major role in unifying Germany, he made an observation about the American Civil War, and he basically said, if the United States was to remain one solid economic and financial bloc, the bankers in Europe that sought to dominate the world, the Rothschilds, they said there were Jewish financiers who wanted to basically loot and pillage various continents. And the way they did it was they wanted to divide the United States into two weak democracies that would be indebted to them. And what Lincoln did when he saw how expensive the Civil War was going to be, he had to borrow the money. He came up with the novel idea of going directly to the people and local financial sources instead of basically borrowing revenue from the bankers in Europe. And they said they had long ago decided in Europe that basically they were going to divide the United States and keep them weak and get them indebted to the point where basically they would just basically absorb all of the resources, all of the property, so on and so forth. And they said ultimately, they said they didn't hesitate to plunge the whole world of Christendom into wars and chaos in order that the earth should become the inheritance of Israel. So, as I say, the Israelite tribes, 12, eight, I think about 9 of them were scattered, and they said they became the various countries in Europe. And that's why a lot of us have Israelite blood in us. But there seems to be 1 or 2 of the tribes that want to basically grab everything for themselves and basically exclude the other inheritors of the tribes of Israel from the world. And I'll tell you something else. George Bush, there's some evidence that he never flew or crash landed in that ocean. A lot of paperwork can be fudged. And the commandant, the Japanese commandant of the nearby island, had made the statement that any American pilot that was captured, he personally would have a certain organ of their body removed, and he would eat it. So like I said, the Japanese were animals. The Japanese military, they were animals. They were monsters, most of them. And I've talked to veterans. My father was over there. My uncle Danny was over there. And on my mother's side, they were over in Europe by and large, and one of them was in an artillery school as a teacher in the United States. But like I said, they'd do anything to win, and they deified that little nearsighted twerp, Hirohito. And they called him Nips because the name for Japan with them was Nippon.
Right. NIP was not really a racial slur. It was just the first few letters of Nippon. And if you look at some of the products under the hood of a Japanese vehicle, it will say Denso, D-E-N-S-O. But the full name of Denso is Nippon Denso. So if you have a German car, it would be Bosch. It would be, if it were an American car, it might be Fomoco for Ford Motor Company, or Mopar for Chrysler, or Delphi for General Motors. But, yeah, they were called Nips and they were called Japs, and because of the first 3 letters. But I got to tell you, there were a lot of Americans who were fighting them, who absolutely hated them, because we were attacked. George, would you like to stay with us?
If I could, yeah.
Sure. And I'd like to hear Captain John's thoughts on this. We'll be right back with Captain John Ragan in George, New Hampshire. Captain John Ragan's with us, and George in New Hampshire is with us. We're talking about war. And Captain John Ragan, your thoughts on what George mentioned?
Well, we were look at progression. While what he was saying is Lincoln prevented the European banks from controlling us in the mid-19th century. It didn't take long in the early 20th century, 1913, before the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And in the century that has ensued since, we're getting ready to reap what's been sown, and it is not going to be pretty.
George?
Well, I was just thinking, Lincoln had his flaws, but one thing he said that made a lot of sense was that, for example, he said, if we buy the rails from England for the train tracks, he said that we have the rails, but they have the money. He says, but if we make the rails here, we not only have the rails, we also have the money. And they found a fanatic in John Wilkes Booth, and they said he was the agent of the international bankers. And I'm not slurring any people or any group or the Jewish people. There's a certain, in every group, there's a certain evil minority that's willing to sell out their own and sell out anyone else for money and power and glory. And I remember, John, you made a very interesting statement, and if you don't mind my asking if you could elaborate it, if it's all right with Vincent, you said if you track a lot of things back to any point in the past, ultimately you find a satanic connection. Could you elaborate? Would you mind, either of you gentlemen, mind if John could do that?
Oh, boy.
Well, I don't mean a sidetrack. Yeah, I just thought maybe you could just shine the flashlight in that corner.
George, we are way off course already, but that's fine. That's absolutely fine. John,
I'm sorry.
No. It's all my fault. I did this when we started the broadcast because I was thinking about the War of Northern Aggression, and I was thinking about World War II and how many people, the leadership of both, of all these corporations got killed for money and for other reasons. But Captain John, your thoughts?
Well, let me start off by saying, whenever you do research, the easiest first level to do is follow the money, and that's in, I think, at least some ways easier for the vast majority of people to follow. The second level is the spiritual warfare side, and that is even tough to have a conversation with Christians about. And in case you haven't been in Genesis lately, we went from creation to deception in 3 chapters. So this whole situation has been going on a long time. You can look at the more modern times, starting with the 19th century. You've got the Communist Manifesto, which is if you understand communism, atheism is not an option, it's required. Although it's not truly atheistic, it's really supporting the God of this world. And as you watch that progress and other sidetracks took off, remember the 19th centuries where industrialization kicked in. And this is where I believe that our modern Christianity totally got off track. And I'm using James 4:4 for this. Being friends of the world is enmity towards God. And as we accepted the technology, we got further and further away from God. And instead of running the church along the lines of how the early Christians did, the church became more worldly and worldly to the point, I believe, about 150 years ago, that became institutionalized. And now we're at the point, probably the least worldly that I know around would be the Amish, and even they have other severe problems. But most of our churches today are basically just entertainment centers. And even if they do get somebody that manages to preach the word, we don't live the word. And I find that so disturbing. And so I guess this is about May when I came to the realization that of how deceived we became just on that one part, and that even if I were able to wake somebody up on that, what advice can I give? Because all the churches have become worldly. But to get back more towards the satanic connection on things, we've got Darwinism, and you can track that. which has done a nice job in putting science in a position where it used to be scientists studied to understand how God did things. Post-Darwin, now science is about how to disprove that there's a God. We've got, like the history of sugar. It is really interesting because the Muslims brought sugar to the Middle East, and before industrialization, that was very, very labor intensive to produce processed sugar. Now, that fueled, that they're already into slavery before that, but that fueled even more slavery to raise the sugar. And of course, when the New World was opened up, the slaves were used over on this side of the Atlantic to produce that. And then you look at how sugar has been used to destroy our health. And so I basically say, if sugar is not part of Satan's plan, it should have been. You look at what I discovered in 2012 from L.A. Marzulli, the occult nature of World War II. There were two different witch groups in Germany, and each one, there were two different saucer programs, and each group had a part in those programs. There was also the Nazi Bell program, which I actually believe there's evidence that goes back to the Second Reich. Then there's electricity, with Tesla being at the head of that. And if you look up one of his interviews, today we'd call it he got that information through channeling. And you can pretty much be sure that the spirits he was talking to were not from God. So there's, I guess it's practically a book's worth I could put together on that. But if there's any other area that you want me to expound on, let me know.
Well,
George, any other thoughts?
Well, yeah, and I'll just say that, John, when you mentioned the DISC programs, meaning the flying saucers, the uninformed, is that they said that there's two stories on how the Germans developed it. One was that one of those discs crashed into somewhere in Bavaria, and it was retrieved, and they back engineered it. The other one was, well, there's actually three. The other story was that whenever they would take over a country, they would go to the libraries and they would seek out legends and myths and whatnot. And they said supposedly they came across an old volume that showed how to build one. And then the third way was that they said they had the Thule Society. They had these German women who were members of the society that could channel somehow, and somehow or other, as the story goes. Now, it's like a riddle wrapped up in an enigma. It's, can we prove this, any of this? Difficult, if not impossible. But they said that they channeled some extraterrestrial entity, and it was revealed to them how to go about engineering one of these flying discs. And the story is that some American firms started building these discs. I think they sought a patent on it, and they were refused, and they were building small ones, 6-foot long ones, but of various sizes, but not overly large. And they said somebody showed up one time, and they claimed that they were from the bankers, and they had some document of paper that informed the factory that basically they were being shut down because it was a threat to the monetary, financial, and utilities, that if they were to come up with this free energy propulsion unit, it would basically render obsolete oil, electricity, among many other things. And they said they closed down the factory, and they also seized all of the assets, all of the equipment, so on and so forth. But the same thing happened with Tesla. I believe he died in 1944, and they said they could tell that when they went into his apartment, he lived in this hotel, I forget where, one of the big cities on the eastern seaboard. But last thing I'll say about it is that they went into his place, and they could tell that someone had gotten to a lot of the paperwork in his files because a lot of his files were missing. And he had done a lot of work, and I think the reason why we even have a lot of modern electric engines was I think he found a way with alternating current that ran trolleys and so on and so forth. It was directly responsible for him, and he really should have been what Edison's reputation is world-renowned. Tesla really, I think, was bigger, smarter, and a more decent gentleman than Edison could ever hope to be.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. And just getting back, there was a secret space program conference in Austin a few years ago, and one of the presenters, before he left, was in the Air Force, part of the AFOSI, so he, professional investigator type. And that's where I pulled the reference of the Nazi bell possibly being from the Second Reich, because there's some documentation on that. But he also talked about, and this goes back to the age of Lincoln, that there were powered aircraft during that time. And based on that research, it kind of looks like all these black programs and the government secrecy could very well have started during Lincoln's time, because after that aircraft was demonstrated, that's when it took a branch and disappeared.
May I just say one more thing after the break, and then I'll get off, because I know you and John Vincent have more things to cover. So
Sure, and Nikola Tesla died in 1943, and he lived in the Wyndham Hotel in New York City. We'll be right back. Captain John Ragan's with us. George in New Hampshire's with us. George, you had a few more comments?
yeah, if I could, like you, John, like you, Vincent, as Paul Harvey used to say, there's the story, and then there's the story behind the story. I'm sure we all stumbled across things that weren't very well known, and actually probably were meant to be unknown, but they couldn't quite clean up all the details, and they left a few strings hanging, so to speak. So what I'll just say is this. You're familiar how at the end of, just about the end of World War II, there was a sub that was reconverted from a mine-laying sub, very large, and it was like a sea cow. It was one of the last of that size vessels that the Germans had, that they loaded in Kiel in March to April. They were outfitting it and loading it up with two completely disassembled Me-262 jet fighters. They had radioactive isotope that was in gold-lined lead container that was extremely heavy that they brought aboard. The sub's nomenclature or markings were U-235. And they said what this vessel did, they had two Japanese intelligence officers on board. They had experts on flak. They had the best minds and the best military strategists that they could find, experts in their field, on this particular ship with all kinds of technology. From the manifest, we really don't know everything, but we know enough of it as to say it was a treasure trove to whichever country it was in was to actually acquire this. So what it did was it left Kiel, it went to Norway. In the fjords in Norway, they had numerous U-boat bases. Then they went from there. They said the Allies threw everything they could at it, but somehow it managed to slip away. They said it positioned itself somewhere not too far from Iceland, and it sat there and waited. Now, supposedly, Hitler had decreed that the Japanese had asked for some enriched uranium, which the Germans, has been proven, and I've seen the pictures and the film on it, they had a reactor. They had the timing mechanisms. They had the isotopes, and I would even go so far as to say they were basically on the verge or actually at the point where the Manhattan Project was. I think the Germans were slightly ahead, but they couldn't really deploy it because by that time most of Germany was overrun. You'll say, what does this have to do with anything? Well, in other words, if they were headed to Japan, as the official story went, you wouldn't go to Iceland. You would head straight down towards the South African Cape of Good Hope and then into the Indian Ocean on the other side and head for Japan. Well, the reason I'm saying all this is I think, as I've been able to piece together, that a deal was made because they said when they found out the war had ended, the captain surfaced and started broadcasting out a message to the Allies. So the Americans contacted them and they said, look, give the Canadians and the British wrong coordinates. Give us the correct coordinates, and they made some sort of a deal. I think part of the deal was they said Borman's last week's activities during the war was tracked where he traveled up to Norway to right at that same base. And from what I believe happened was a deal was made that in exchange for technology and to give the United States the edge in the technological and future wars, instead of it falling in the Soviet hands, they made a deal to allow Hitler and certain segments of the hierarchy in the Third Reich to escape. And I think Hitler went, you know, from Harry there, I forget his name, from Shark Hunters, he said this. But from what I've been able to piece together, a deal was made, and they said the two Japanese officers committed suicide because they didn't want to be taken alive. And they said the German crew was laughing at them because they were painting U-235, and they basically said, can't these guys count? We're U-234. So they said that. The last thing I'll say on it is they said that we didn't have the proper timing mechanisms to ensure efficient ignition on our atomic bombs, and they said they did not have enough fissionable material, isotope, to make a second bomb, and that the second bomb, to a large degree, was dependent upon the refined uranium ore that they found on that sub, and it was used on Nagasaki. I believe Nagasaki was the second one. I hope I'm correct on that. But anyway, this is what I've pieced together. So a deal was made, and technology was exchanged. Hitler was declared dead. That made the bulk of the military that had sworn an oath to the Fuhrer to basically surrender, because now that their leader was dead, that null and voided the oath that they had taken. And that's all I'm going to say, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be in the company of such as you. God bless. Bye-bye.
George, thank you so much. And by the way, class, U-235, uranium-235 is an isotope. It can sustain a fission reaction, and the term for a German submarine was undersea boat, and they had the nomenclature U followed by a number. So U-235 is a very interesting name and number for that boat. Captain John Ragan and I'll be right back after top of the hour news and commercial announcements. This is USA Prepares. Captain John Ragan is with us, and George from New Hampshire called in, and he mentioned Harry Cooper. And Harry Cooper is the owner of sharkhunters.com. So if you're interested in World War II history, Harry Cooper is a USA Prepares instructor. Website, sharkhunters.com. And calling in from Florida, in the direct path of Hurricane Dorian, is Steve Elkins. Steve, you got an update for us?
Yeah, well, as far as where I'm going to be outside of Orlando, we're going to look at not too bad winds, 40 to 60 mile per hour. Some gusts, some heavy rain at times, rain accumulation, not too bad. Actually, I think it's around 2 to 4 inches, which we can handle that. But it's been an interesting time last week. I've been prepared for a while. I did a little fine tuning at the end there because I'm on a well system, and I'm going to lose electricity. And probably lose electricity, so my well is on electric. So problem there, but we have excess water, so we're in good shape there. But it's been interesting, driving around town, the mood of, this is my first hurricane down here in this area, and it's very interesting, the mood of people are just kind of focused and directional, and they're not smiling, they're not talking much, they're just grabbing what they need, and these people have been here a lot longer than I have. I've been here just a year and a half. But the gas lines the gas ran out for a while, and it's back stocked up again, so people are getting that. A lot of supplies are still missing. You can't find extension cords, 14 gauge anywhere. You can find tons of 16. And they must have had a surge of shipments of generators in the last couple of days because they're everywhere. You can find generators. But I think what my cousin and I talked about down in Vero Beach, Florida, there's a lot of, I blame the Weather Channel for this. They cry wolf quite a bit. And when the real one really does come along, you'll not know it because every time they cry wolf, everybody jumps, and then finally they become desensitized. And he's down there talking about it. And he's very angry because he's actually more in the path than I am right now, and he's sitting still. I'm staying where I am. My other sources telling me that we're going to get some wind and everything, some rain, but it's not going to be a direct hit. But the Weather Channel will tell you just the opposite, and they do this all the time. So I'm calling this storm porn, little fear propaganda storm porn, and they're very good at that. And he's actually wising up quite a bit. He said, this is all for ratings, this is all for commerce, money, advertising dollars. And I said, you are absolutely correct. So I think we're going to be fine. We may lose electricity for a little while, but I think we're going to be fine out here. But, there's really no excuse for people out here who've lived here a long time, who are not prepared. And you can see that when you go in the stores and you see the batteries are all gone, this is all gone, this is all gone. And, we do have a hurricane season, and it ends in November. But people are just, this is that gambling attitude, Vincent, I talked to you about. Americans are the biggest gamblers. They gamble on everything they gamble on. I'm not a gambler, so I'm going to be better prepared for the next one. I'm pretty good prepared now, but better next time. I'm getting a couple more items on my list, and I've thought about some things and for the future. So I'm never going to be one of those people that's dependent on government for anything.
Steve, I'll tell you what. Next time we're on, which will be soon, let's talk about what you prepared for and what you would have liked to have had that you didn't have, but next time you will have, and we'll talk about that. But quick question.
Yeah.
What about price gouging? Have you seen it? Has gas gone up? Has it spiked? No,
actually, it has not. It has not, and they're putting out websites and telling people information. If you see gouging anywhere, hotel rooms, gas, please report it. I have not seen it. The gas companies surely have done this in the past, and they have not. They've locked down the price. It stayed the same. Nothing's changed. All the gas stations are pretty much the same price, so no gouging there. Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, I've made it a policy that whenever there is a calamity and there's gouging, I remember that, and I never go back there. Never. So, any questions from Captain John Ragan?
Well, you guys moved so fast today. You were on the Civil War, which I love that kind of stuff, and you moved on to Germany, and you moved on to saucers and stuff. By the way, feel free to share what I've told you about Roswell with your listening audience and my grandfather, who was a brigadier general at the Pentagon. Feel free to share that anytime you want to. I don't fear any retaliation. What my grandfather told my father was the truth. My father shared that with me.
I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll put that in the same broadcast that you and I do together, and our class can get it right from the horse's mouth. Anything else, Steve?
Just a comment. You guys talked about religion for a little bit, and I had something I've written down here that my father told me once. The power of religion, using guilt to gain profit. And religion is the opiate for the masses. Basically, a cheap psychiatrist. Your cost is 10% tithing. And so aside of having a real opiate addiction, drug addiction in this country, yes, we have an opiate addiction, all right, and religion's included.
Very good. Steve, thanks so much.
You got it.
Stay safe. That was Steve Elkins in Florida, near Orlando. Captain John Ragan, back to you.
Well, as the show was starting last hour, I checked the silver chart. And to just go ahead and put a little perspective on it, Friday it closed at 1834. At the beginning of the show, it was 1875, and I just checked this last break, and it's 1895. And I've been watching silver closely for, especially since the beginning of July, and I've watched them try to smack it down again, and every time it has gotten right back up. I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen, but things are different this time as opposed to, watching it since the silver crash in 2011. And it's interesting times coming, and there's so many pieces to this puzzle, which not only include the trade war. You got Hong Kong, you got Brexit, you got Iran, and we don't know which one of those is going to pop first. We do have a date for Brexit, and I'm expecting us to see some very interesting silver prices by the end of the year. I'm trying to prioritize what's coming. I know we're getting ready to hit a break. I've got some notes that I'd planned on talking about that really needs to be an article, but it ties in very well with what we ended up discussing last hour. And but the topic is secrets. And not only does that cover a little bit what we have, but there's some videos I'm going to talk about. And in two of those three videos, secrets play an important part that are still basically mucking with science today. Did you want to add anything?
I have a quick comment. You mentioned just a couple minutes ago, silver was at 1895. Not anymore. This chart is almost straight up. It's now at 1913, according to Kitco. So for those silver bugs out there, if you already got it, good for you. Good for you. It's on the move. And what does that tell you, Captain John Ragan, that people are starting to really worry? I don't know a single person, not a single person whom I've spoken with in about a month, who is maybe 3 months really, who is not concerned. They can feel it. They can feel it in their bones that things are really, really not normal. They're concerned that the economy may tank. They feel that the supply chain is precariously perched, that it's difficult to get people to work on things because people don't know how to do that anymore. We don't know how to fix things. The things that we're buying are breaking sooner, faster, and companies are walking away from the warranty responsibilities. Products are cheaper. Now, I don't mean less expensive. I mean junky. And we're seeing it everywhere. And people are saying, well, heck, that phone's 3 years old. What do you expect? How can you expect it to, last? It's 3 years old. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. I've got, right in the studio, I have a desk telephone. It's at least 30 years old. At least 30 years old. And it works great. I have a switching system that powers all of my equipment. It's at least 30 years old, maybe 35. So things were made to last a long time. It's just not anymore.
Well, there's another side of that, too.
Yeah.
When we were growing up, if something happened to your toaster, you'd take it into the repair shop. You wouldn't go out and buy a new toaster.
Or fix it yourself. And those toaster repair shops, those fix-it shops, they're all gone. People don't have things fixed anymore. I remember a couple years ago, I had a pair of Red Wing farm boots. The leather was still good, but the soles were worn out. So I called a couple shoe repair places, and I said, I'm thinking about getting these resold. And I explained what I had. And I said, so what does that cost? And the guy said, $75 to $85. And I said, no. I'm not asking to buy a new pair of boots. I'm just talking about having them resold. And the guy was trying to tell me that that's what it costs now. Now, the whole pair of boots when I bought them was $118. So prices are really high. I don't know how anybody can afford anything today. I mean, literally. I got Captain John, I'm just tell you this. I broadcast from the corrupt state of Missouri. That's until we move out of here. I got a document from the Missouri Department of Revenue Taxation Division dated May 3rd, 2019. They say effective January 1st of 2019, like over 5 months prior. So they're saying effective 5 months before the letter was sent to me, this notice, that they're going to change my filing of taxes from annually to quarterly. They changed it. And then they said that I agreed to this. Our records indicate that you elected to file electronically. And if you didn't receive the forms, go and get them, download them. So I've written arrows all over this thing, and I said, you sent this on 5/3/2019 to be effective 5 months prior. What's with you guys? That's what I said. Quote, what's with you guys? Okay. Then I drew an arrow to the part where it says, if you did not receive this form prior to filing, download it. I said, it's never been received. Arrow drawn to that. And then it's our records indicate that you elected to file electronically. I drew an arrow to that. Not true. Never elected electronic filing. And then it says, we'll continue to report annually as originally established. Vincent Finelli, CEO. What I'm telling you is these guys make this stuff up. Captain John Ragan's with us. Class, you might want to watch the price of silver today. You can go to Kitco, KITCO.com, and look at the silver chart, and you'll get a chance to see what's happening. Captain John, back to you.
Yeah, the price is just absolutely shocking. And, you know, it's good news for me, bad news for what's coming.
Right.
And speaking of that, the last time I was on USA Prepares was July 15th, and the post for that, as well as the second hour of the show, if you go to the archives, that was the financial end of the road. And I can't really say there's an update for that, but the point being is, you know, all the signs are here. I still can't tell you exacts on timing, but you're going to be surprised how quickly things will unfold when they unfold. And that line, and this is something we'll talk about next week because there's plain not enough time today. My recommendation is, if you can, get out of the United States, because it is not going to be a pretty place to be, even if you're in rural areas. So you got that to look forward to next week. I wanted to talk about secrets. And I've talked about my experience before. The F-117A, the stealth fighter, that contract was let when I was a cadet in ROTC. And, of course, the Air Force isn't in the habit of informing cadets about highly classified projects. But in late 1985, that fall, is when I showed up at the Pentagon to take my position in the nuclear planning system area. And those 2.5 years that I spent at the Pentagon, I didn't know about the F-117A, even though it was a delivery system for nuclear weapons. I found out about it, shortly after leaving the Air Force, when the public found out about it. Another thing that I didn't know about being in nuclear planning was electromagnetic pulse, EMP. And I found out about that when the EMP report was released after Congress embodied the 9/11 EMP Commission. And EMP is something that the government has known about at least since the early 60s when they had that Starfish Prime explosion in the atmosphere. And you might say, well, John, you were just a captain. That's fair enough. But let's talk about Harry Truman. Harry Truman, when 1945 started, was Vice President of the United States. We were just a few months away from having the working nuclear, fusion and fission weapons that were used against Japan. When FDR died, that was the point where Harry Truman found out about these weapons. So secrets have been around for a long time. That event was, well before I was born. Got some videos in my post today. These were released last month in the Suspicious Observers channel on YouTube. And if you don't watch that, you really should at least watch the news part that's published every morning. And he released 3 videos, Plasma Cosmology, Cosmic Disaster / CIA Classified, and Climate Forcing. Each of these videos are about an hour each, and even if you've watched for years, this is a nice summary and might even include some things that you've forgotten or didn't know about. In the Plasma Cosmology, one of the scientists in there worked at, let's go ahead and take the break and talk about it when we come back.
Yeah, Captain John Ragan's with us. We'll be right back. Captain John, you mentioned EMPs and you mentioned secrets. I got to tell you that for the last 5 years, I've been on stage at Laclede Electric Cooperative's annual meetings, and they laughed at me. The GDP laughed at me about EMPs. I'm stunned. I'm stunned at how dumb we really, really are. Please continue.
Before the break, I was talking about the first of the 3 videos I have in my list today, Plasma Cosmology. Part of this includes a segment by a physicist that worked at Los Alamos, which, highly classified research going on there. And it took him years, but he's able to get some of his research declassified. And what that research shows is that there is no such thing as dark matter. And you think about the PhDs, the academicians, how many hundreds of thousands of people do we have working to find dark matter, which that search is not going well, millions of dollars, maybe even billions going into these projects, when we knew about this decades ago, and the declassified information is not being widely spread yet. So another, just demonstrating how secrets affect us. Because even though it may not impact your daily life so much, it's impacting your pocketbook because some of your taxes are going to that. It's also interesting, they had another scientist on that is a good segment to use when you want to show that settled science really isn't settled. And he goes back to Newton. And there's a couple of things to bring out there. One, Newton, who gave us the inverse square law, and that's valid for electromagnetic energy, which includes things like light. It's valid for sound. Whatever your measurement is at one distance, you double it, you have 1/4 of the amount to measure at that point. Well, there was another side of that has been a gold standard for physicists, is that when you look at a system, all that matters is that system. And that kind of goes back to the inverse square law, because other systems are so far away, the effect essentially is nothing. Well, they did research, and the inverse square law is true all the way down to a radius of 0. And that gets to be kind of interesting because, 0 squared is still 0, and you invert that and you have infinity. And I noticed he hesitated a little bit in describing this. To me, I think what he found was the scientific explanation for scalar energy, also known as Tesla technology, and that the energy is the same at distance. And this even, I think, impacts our view of God and the universe. As we've discovered all of these galaxies out there, we tend to think that, wow, why are those out there? Why did God have to create that? They don't affect us because they're so far away. Well, that's not true. We find out that that energy from that distance is affecting each and every one of us. And, I can say stay tuned, because we're learning more and more in that area. The second video, he had a catastrophe series that started in January, and this was the first time I'd heard the term micronova. And it started off, the first segment of that was about a book, The Adam and Eve Story, which was classified by the CIA back in the 60s. And when the Freedom of Information request brought it out, it was highly redacted. They only released like 57 pages or so out of a more than 200-page book. And it gets into the story of cycles of catastrophe, where the sun, shoots off a shell, and this is probably what did things like vitrifying these stones that, ancient aliens claims that it was aliens that, with some kind of, weapon caused that to happen. Now, it doesn't look like that anymore. Looks like it's quite natural. But it's really interesting. It gets into how that energy can, mess with the internals of the Earth enough to where the crust separates from the mantle, and like the skin of an orange would allow a physical shift versus the just plain movement of the pole. Like I say, it's an hour video. I can't get very deep into that. I highly recommend that as a summary. But it also got me thinking in conjunction with secrets. John Moore talks about, I believe it was in the 60s, a meeting where admirals were briefed about this planet coming in. And I'm beginning to believe that was actually a psyop, being perpetrated on the admirals, because this is about the time that they classified this, and I'm sure they knew about it before this, cycle disaster. And why I think they don't want people to know about it, because if people knew about it and accepted it, we would have total chaos as a society. Why go to work? It would just be a big mess. Well, with telling the admirals that it's going to be a planet from out in the solar system, they have the admirals looking the wrong way while they're building the underground shelter for the selected few that get to be saved from the disaster. And Of course, they can't build enough to save the entire population. So, again, there's another hour for you to invest in. And the third one's climate forcing. And this one just so totally destroys the climate, and let me use the air quote, scientists, when you see all of the things that they do not include in their model. And when you see some of the papers, many of which are from universities outside of the United States, you get a much different picture, and it is not carbon dioxide. And instead of having global warming, it looks more like we're on the verge of another, at least mini ice age, if not more. So for your viewing pleasure, I have that. And I'll go ahead and stop and let you comment.
A couple quick comments. So, class, if you'd like to watch these videos, you can go to thefinancialstateoftheunion.com, John Ragan's website. You can also get to it with the following, eze33.org. And you can go right to the news tab, and you'll see the links to today's broadcast, thefinancialstateoftheunion.com. And if you want to watch these videos, YouTube videos, on your television, which for me is better because Mrs. Finelli and I can sit side by side and we can watch videos on a larger screen than a PC screen, you can type in the following at a search engine. You can type watch YouTube on TV. Watch YouTube on TV. And you'll find out that you can watch YouTube videos on your television screen if you have a set-top device or if you have a TV that lets you make selections, kind of like what you would with Netflix or Prime Video. So there you have it. And that's what I'm going to do, John. I'm going to watch them with Mrs. Finelli, the next couple of days.
Yeah, all I can say is prepare to be amazed. And I don't have the link here. It was a video that was recommended from YouTube. And this guy, what he put into that video just knocked my socks off. He dealt with the Sahara Desert, and there's more and more research coming out all the time, but there's a number of ruins under the desert. And keep in mind, our minds are kind of warped a little bit because we're used to seeing flat maps, which make the sizes of the land masses skewed. The Sahara Desert is roughly the size of the United States, might even be larger than the United States. So it's a huge, huge area. And it used to be a lush area. Lots of water, lakes, amazing place. So with them this penetration technology, like the ground penetrating radar that's allowed them to discover more and more of this, lots of these, cities have been found, and we know nothing about these civilizations. And the conversion from these lush areas to desert may have taken place in as little as 100 years, may have been 500 years, but even in geologic time frames, that's nothing. So some pretty amazing stuff. I may dig that out and give a link next time for people that want to watch that. But when you think about all the things that have gone on before us that we know nothing about, we don't even have good understandings in parts of our modern history. And you can start with the JFK assassination on to so many other things. And we look back, we really don't know a lot about the pyramid builders, the Sphinx builders, Göbekli Tepe. And those are just the ones that we know about. Be fascinating if we had, the time travel technology and understand what all happened before our modern era. And I'll go ahead and stop there before talking about the remaining 3 points I have.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. I'm very concerned about this winter and it getting very cold and the extra feed that we're going to need. So what we're doing today, cutting hay, raking hay, baling hay. That's what we're going to be doing for the next several days because now we have the window. And many of us believe, many farmers who are paying attention believe it's going to be a rough winter. We'll be right back. Tomorrow, I'm going to try to talk about a major design flaw in John Deere riding lawnmowers. Major design flaw. And I've experienced this, and I've tried to rectify it, but I'll explain it in detail tomorrow. Robert in Kansas, welcome. You're on with Captain John Ragan.
Thank you, Vincent. I heard your conversation earlier about the Civil War, and I wanted to explain to you how it was actually about slavery, just not the way that we're taught in school. The situation in 1776 was that we established a constitutional republic which restrained the government so that the human man was able to be free. And when I say that, I mean that he owned the land he bought, his labor was not taxed away from him, and he was actually free. And then what took place in the Civil War was to bring about essentially what happened in 1871 when the United States incorporated. And under the incorporation, what took place was then the stock held by the corporation, the livestock, the human beings, were then issued a birth certificate and held on the stock exchange for a certain value. And then they could be borrowed against. So your life has a certain value, and then the corporation can borrow against that value to the banks. If you are a banker, what you must have is every nation be a corporation, because a corporation runs not on the blood of men and the soil and the people, but it runs on money. And so by them controlling the money, they can control the nations. And that's truly where we became enslaved again, is in 1871 when we became a corporation. And then we were then held as livestock under that corporation where we can be taxed. Our property can be taxed away from us. Everything is, we don't really own anything. And that's what a slave is.
Very, very well said. So you're not talking about black slaves, plantation-type slaves. You're talking about all of us.
It's just a sophisticated form of it. It's not the black slavery where you held slaves and you fed them, and it's more of a free-range slavery where we're allowed a certain amount of freedom. However, we do not actually own. We don't actually own anything the way a slave doesn't own anything.
Mm-hmm. So from a corporate perspective, what's better than having slaves, meaning economic slaves that you don't really have to worry about feeding and taking care of? You just control them economically. So you have all the benefits and very few of the liabilities. That's what you're saying. Captain John Ragan, your comments?
Very true. And don't forget, slaves aren't allowed to have guns.
Well, that's in the works, right?
Yeah. Beto O'Rourke, also known as, I believe his name is Robert. He wants to confiscate your self-defense tools, known as black rifles, AR-15s. He is I believe he's a real danger to society. Some might even call him a menace because of what he wanted to do. By the way, he was arrested when he was younger for criminal trespass. Beto O'Rourke. Robert O'Rourke wants to be president. So we've got him, and we've got a self-proclaimed homo, who wants to be president. That's Mayor Pete What's-His-Butt, or Pete Butts' gig, however you pronounce it. What a slate of candidates. Unbelievable. We're going down fast, and the pink and green and blue-haired people are invading our lives, telling us what we should do. I have one comment, John. It's not. It was not something we were going to discuss today, but I think it's important, and I'd like to say it. What I'm hearing from people who are in hospice care and others, they're saying that those people who are the beneficiaries of the soon-to-be deceased estate can't wait. Can't wait. They argue in the presence of the person dying. They're carving up the assets in the presence of the person who's dying before the person dies. They can't wait to get what they believe they're going to inherit. It's an outrage. Absolute outrage. So, class, think about before you sign over your assets to young people. Make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure they deserve it. Any comments, Robert in Kansas?
Well, Vince, to your point, if you want to actually take people's families from them and you want to actually take their property, like physically, it's a lot easier if they're disarmed first. So
yes.
if they really want to come for your children, they're going to take your guns first.
Well said. And you have military expertise, both you and Captain John Ragan. Captain John, your thoughts?
Yeah, like I say, stay tuned. It's going to be interesting. And like I said earlier, if you can possibly get out of the United States, that's what I recommend.
But where do we go? Where do we go? Do we go to South America?
There is no perfect place. My target is Belize, and we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah. Robert in Kansas, thank you so much for calling in and being with us. Captain John Ragan, as always, thank you for your friendship. You and I have known each other for quite a while. You've been broadcasting with me for darn close to 8 years, if I'm not mistaken. And we've been going to events together, speaking at events. Thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge. And in about a month, Rich Sheehan will be back with us when he's done with his farming.